and we can see that Dutch Thompson is a very big draw to a talk, and that is very pleasing. You never know on a night like this how many people you will get. I will wait until Dutch comes back. Yeah. You're watering yourself down. My name is Doug Sobey. I'm the president of the Bygone Area Historical Society, and I want to welcome you all to the first of this summer 8 Monday evening talks or events. We normally have 6, but we were overcrammed with topics which we felt we had to cover. And not by design, Dutch chose this first of the talks, and it's I thought he would also be a good draw, and it has turned out to be so. Dutch Thompson, I don't really need to say very much, but you probably know his voice better than you know his life story, I think. And I'm just going to say a few things. His real name is Reginald. He gave that up a very long time ago, and he comes from Bunbury, which is the other side of Charlottetown, for those of you who don't know where Bunbury is. He's a retired theatre lighting designer and technician, and as we know, a passionate oral historian and storyteller. Dutch is best known for his CBC radio program, the Bygone Days, and I'm sure you've all heard it on the afternoon program of CBC, which has been airing for 34 years, with more than 12,000 broadcasts, believe it or not. Dutch has amassed 1,100 hours of interviews with people born between 1894 and 1932. And is there anyone in the room that was interviewed by Dutch who's here? Unfortunately, I think most of the people have now passed on, which is all the more valuable that Dutch has recorded their stories and words and are now part of the island story and the island archives. Most of his collection of interviews have been digitalized and preserved by the UPEI library in the Dutch Thompson collection. So you actually can go there and listen to them, or listen to many of them online. His research has been used by scholars and amateur historians all around the world. And since 2019, he has published 2 books, The Bygone Days and More Bygone Days. And these are based on the interviews that he has compiled. I don't think he brought any of the books tonight for sale. They're too much of a load to carry. But they're available in the bookshops. Dutch has received 6 Heritage Awards from the PEI Museum and Heritage Foundation, including the Award of Honor in 2016. And this year, he has been awarded an honorary degree from the University of Prince Edward Island. And just last month, his appointment to the Order of Prince Edward Island was announced. So very much deserved. Dutch attended Charlottetown Rural High School, holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from Dalhousie, and did graduate studies at St. Francis Xavier University. He lives in a 175-year-old house in Bunbury with his wife, who is with him tonight, Jill Birtwhistle, where he says they spend all their spare time and money maintaining the house. Dutch could talk in depth about a range of topics, but he all related to the island's social history. But tonight he's going to talk on a subject which he himself has chosen. It's an island A to Z, odd and unusual PEI, from animals to Zeppelins. From stories from bygone days about bears, midwives, war heroes, lighthouse keepers, and moonshine. So Dutch, we're very pleased to have you here tonight to give us a talk.
Checking 1, 2. That's better, eh? You can hear me? Yeah. That's too bad. You may regret that in a few minutes.
Good.
Well, thank you, Doug, for the lovely introduction. I didn't know most of that, in fact, about myself, but now I do. It's great to be here, and if you do me a favor, Doug, and if you kill the lights, that'll make the screen just a little bit brighter. That's better, and then I don't have to look at all these people that are looking at me. So the idea is everybody look at the screen, nobody has to look at me. My wife is going to keep me going because I'll get off on a tangent and she'll, so if the slide advances and I'm still yapping about something else, it's because she's telling me to hurry up. This is our first time doing this talk, so bear with us. We're not quite there yet. So, what's unusual about this photo? Can anybody tell me? Have a good look at that cow.
3 legs.
It's only got 3 legs. I asked the farmer why it only had 3 legs. And his barn fell in one time and hit him on the head. He was knocked out and the cow dragged him out and saved his life. And I said, but that doesn't explain why the cow only has 3 legs. And he said, my God, man, a cow that's smart, you're not going to eat all at once. So in the course of my interviews, one of the things I always ask folks on the interview between 600 to 700 people here on the island and in England and Scotland and Wales and also Nova Scotia. I always ask about horses, and islanders, of course, are famous for their horse flesh. And inevitably, when you ask to see a family portrait, there's a horse in the picture. And that just shows what people thought of the horses. It was part of the family, and a treasured part of the family. There's the favorite chickens, and then of course along came the automobile and things changed. People started getting their pictures taken on the with the car. There was a fellow I interviewed, Richie Smith from Mount Tom, over near Campbell's Pond here on PEI, and he told me I kept a horse on the farm just to look at. And he was one of the first farmers in that area, in the New Glasgow area, to actually have a tractor, and he kept a farm anyway. Albert Clow was the Clyde River mailman for over 40 years, and like all mailmen, he did all kinds of other things as well. He delivered messages and pick up groceries and acted as a taxi, actually taking folks down to the train station and things like that. One day, he found an alarm clock in the mailbox with a note, please wind the clock and set the time. Have not had the right time for 3 days. So this is Austin and Vivian Graham. She was a white, she was from Murray Harbour, he's from Bayview up near Cavendish. And when he was 19 years old, he had an uncle working at the Pure Milk Company in Charlottetown, which later became Garden City on Fitzroy Street, on the corner of Fitzroy and what was Elm Avenue at the time. They had 4 teams of white horses that went around delivering milk, and so he rolls in, happy as Larry, to get a job at 19 years old. And the fella he was replacing said, here's where you pick up the milk in the morning, and you get the cream over there, and the ice cream's over there, and the butter's over there, and this is where you bring the bottles back when you're done at night, and the horse goes down to Farquharson's stable. See you later, have fun. Wait, Austin said, I don't know my route. He said, you don't have to know the route. The horse knows the route. And sure enough, when he went out with the horse stopped at every house that took their milk, and he didn't have to know anything. He also had a white horse that didn't like snow, and the first time it snowed, the horse sat down in front of the police station and wouldn't move. Now, he had a neighbor, when he was a young fellow growing up, he had a neighbor who actually brought in what were called Western horses, and there was a fellow by the name of Walter Weeks in Hunter River, and a fellow in T Hill, also in Charlottetown, by the name of Wellington McNeil, and they brought in these wild Western horses. And they were popular with the farmers because you could buy a horse for under $100, big and strong, but they all had their idiosyncrasies. Every horse was a little bit different, a little wild, a little crazy. I talked to a blacksmith, and he said they'd get a call saying, be down at the waterfront in the morning, there's a carload of horses, of these Western horses coming in, all from Alberta, and they were literally wild. And he told me if they could get shoes on 2 of the feet, they'd keep the horse. If they couldn't get shoes on the horse, then went back into the boxcar, went to Halifax, got on a boat, went to Belgium or France, and was eating for dinner. So they had a neighbor, Austin's dad was Will Graham, and they had a neighbor who had bought one of these Western horses. And this was a horse, its trick was it didn't like getting its feet wet. So they were standing in the farmyard one day, and they saw the neighbor coming down the road with a load of hay, and it had rained the night before. And there were puddles all over the road, and sure enough, the minute the horse came to one of the puddles, he stopped dead. No way he was going to get his feet wet in that puddle. So they could see the farmer tugging and pulling on the reins and slapping him on the rump, and the horse not a movement out of him. So Austin's father, Will, said, I'll move that horse. He said, you watch this. So he walked down through his front field, and he said, John, you're having a hard time with that horse. Yes, I can't get it to move. He said, well, I can get him to move. He said, well, you do whatever you need to do, Will. So he stood back, and Will grabbed the armload of hay off the back of the wagon, and he put it under the horse's belly, and he lit it on fire. And the horse stood there, and finally the flames were licking up around his belly, and the horse and the wagon jumped over the puddle to the other side, where there was another puddle, so the horse stopped dead again. By now, he had put the wagon and the load of hay over the fire, and the wagon and the load of hay went up in flames. Now, did you know anybody from PEI? How many people aren't from PEI? There's quite a few. Well, we actually never had deer on PEI until 1950. And then the premier at the time, a fellow by the name of J. Walter Jones, he decided that all the islanders going to the mainland to hunt, he was going to keep them here on the island. So he imported between 100 and 200 white-tailed deer from the mainland. And he brought them over. And as you can see, they were fairly tame. He had them in, those snow fences. They had them in the snow fences. That's his daughter, Vimy Jones. Jay Walters, that's his daughter, Vimy. And of course, you know why she's called Vimy, because she was born in 1917. And she said there was a barn full of deer when she was a girl growing up. Now, those deer used to get loose all the time, and they would run through the woods over what's now Reeves Estates, and what's now the Trans-Canada onto the other side, the crossroads. And they would go into this house that was owned by the McKinnon family, and you can see the front porch. There was a couch on the front porch, and the old fella Neil and the young fella by the name of Brent, he was only 12, the old fellow was 82, and the deer would go up and curl up on the couch beside one of them. And their daughter-in-law, Queenie McKinnon, who I got to know really well, told me that she'd look out at any time of the day, and the deer would be curled up on the couch with either Neil or with the young fella. They were that tame. That's the daughter-in-law of J. Walter Jones, that's Jean Jones. One day in the same area over by Reeves Estates, which is all houses now, but it was all orchards at one time, and B. Reeves was washing the dishes, and she looked out, and there were deer eating the apples off her trees, and she had no idea where the deer came from, so she phoned for the wildlife officer, a fellow by the name of Spurgeon Jenkins, and he showed up. He knew what was going on. He loaded him in the back of his truck, and away he went. All the deer were gone. We did some talks up in the Mill River area, up in the western end of the island, and people up there told me that there were deer still in the woods up there into the early 1960s. But for the most part, the deer get into people's gardens. The one thing J. Walter Jones forgot to do was put a hunting season limit on the deer, so they all got shot, except for 2 or 3 that wound up in the woods up in the western end of the island. And I just want to mention this lady here is one of my heroes. She was a midwife who was gone all the time, and then she got the job as a telephone operator in the biggest world exchange on the island, and so she had to spend more time at home. So she cleaned out some upstairs bedrooms, and she turned it into a birth house, and it's only one of 2 birth houses I ever heard of on PEI. And all kinds of pregnant girls would come out and stay with her for a week or 2 weeks, or some even a month. It was her daughter-in-law Queenie told me that there were lots of unwed girls would show up, because just down the road was the orphanage, was the Protestant orphanage, and they'd come out when they started showing, and they'd be there for maybe 2 or 3 months, and then they'd have the baby, and the baby would be whisked off down to the orphanage. Now, J. Walter, as I mentioned, was a fellow that actually brought those deer in. And a pretty amazing guy. I don't know anybody else who's in 3 halls of fame. He's in the Canadian Agricultural Hall of Fame, the Atlantic Agricultural Hall of Fame, and he's also in the PEI Sports Hall of Fame. He was a tremendous athlete. He was a scientist. He was an educator. He wrote books on fox farming, silver fox farming, and he also wrote books on dairy cattle. And that's his adequate herd on the front lawn of what was the herdsman's house in Bunbury. That was at one time, that was the #1 world-class herd of Holsteins in the world, and that was here on PEI. He sold cattle all over the world, and interestingly, that house was built by someone from this area, from the Bedeck area, a fellow by the name of John Baker. That's the same house again in 1900, and that's the same house now, and that's the one that causes my wife and I so much grief. That's where we live. Interestingly, one of the things that J. Walter wound up doing, he was sent to the States and he was trained to become a principal at one of 4 schools, special schools in Canada known as the MacDonald Consolidated Schools, in this case the Hillsborough Consolidated School. And they were built, all 4 schools were built. There was one in Milton, Nova Scotia, one in Ontario, and one in Quebec, and one here in the island. And the schools were funded by tobacco money, because anybody that smoked Export A, which was my brand when I smoked back in the day, that company was actually formed by an islander by the name of MacDonald, who was from Trackety Cross here on PEI. One of the interesting things about the schools, and I don't know if it was the same all across the country, but the one here had what I would call the first school buses. They were what they call vans. There were also vans in Summerside, at one of the schools in Summerside, and also in Tryon, in North Tryon as well. But rather unusually, the fellow that drove the van will go around and pick up students. Half the students used to come on the train into the Mount Herbert station, and the train didn't get in to 9:15, but they were allowed to be 15 minutes late because they were coming in from the eastern end of the island. Just down the road from that, in Mount Herbert, which had a cheese factory, 2 grocery stores, an Orange Lodge, what else? The MacDonald Consolidated School, and it also had the first Protestant orphanage on the island, and that is the original Protestant orphanage. It's still standing. It was donated by a man by the name of the Reverend Daniel McLean, whose sons went on to do some great things in their lives as well. One of them started the McLean Funeral Home in Charlottetown, and the other one, I'm sure, I know I learned how to write this way, but the McLean method of writing actually was invented by a guy from Mount Herbert, PEI, and he was the vice principal under J. Walter Jones of that school. Rather interestingly. Then he moved to BC, and that's where he developed the McLean method of writing that so many of us learned how to write. Now they say kids aren't able to write. Everything has to be typed. So, and the Reverend McLean, he was also a member of the Orange Lodge that I mentioned, was just up by the Protestant orphanage. And they helped actually run the orphanage. And I talked to several orphans who told me that they'll be given presents on Christmas Day. And then on New Year's Eve, the presents were all taken away from them and put back in the closet for the next year. Pretty sad existence, eh? So those linden trees line what was J. Walter Jones's driveway. It goes for almost a quarter of a mile down. And the linden trees also wound up by the orphanage. Now this is the second Protestant orphanage. It was made out of bricks. And it's surrounded by linden trees, and I happened to interview a fellow by the name of Milton Buell from the eastern end of the island, and he wound up being the caretaker of the school when it opened around 1930. And he and a boy, as he said, went down with a wagon and a horse, and they asked J. Walter if they could dig up saplings in the field next to that line of trees I showed you. And he said, you take all the trees you want. And they dug up trees, and they're all around the school. And that is the same site now where the PEI Diction Foundation has their premises. And every time we drive by, we see people sitting out underneath those linden trees in the shade. So the trees are still giving, joy to people. And interestingly, they're not native to PEI, those linden trees. They were brought here in 1806 by a fellow by the name of John McNaughton Norton. Now his real name was John McNaughton. He was from Scotland. He was a botanist and a landscape gardener, and he couldn't get work with a name like McNaughton in England. And so he changed his name to Norton. So all the Nortons on PEI can go back to this one guy, and that's not their real name. Their real name is McNaughton. He actually wound up working on the famous Kew Gardens in London, and then he came here in 1806 as the High Sheriff and the Justice of the Peace for Kings County. He wasn't sure where he was going, and he was afraid there wouldn't be trees on PEI in 1806. And so he put 100 of those linden trees in the hold of the ship and brought them over with him. And to give him credit, he looked around, he didn't see many English oak trees, and he sent back on the next vessel and said, send me over 100 English oak, and we have English oak thanks to him as well. Now, speaking of people who were, you know, I don't know what the word is, inventive, I guess. One of the glues I use a lot, and in fact I was using some today, is the well-known LePage's glue. That was invented here by an islander, actually invented in New Jersey by an islander. But he had fished as a young fella out of Rustico, and he noticed that the scales were awful hard to get off the boots and off the inside of the dories. And when he was down in New Jersey, he started experimenting with different things to make glue, and he took the sounds, the little bladders in the fish that go up and down, because he knew they were sticky as well, because he cleaned a lot of cod and hake in his life, and he mixed it all together, and he came up with that glue. He also invented oarlocks for dories, and that was very successful, and he also invented a holster for guns, where the gun would pop up into your hand, and that didn't work out. But the glue's still going. 60 years later, one of his descendants wound up starting up what was at one time the largest real estate company in the world. It may be still, I don't know, but it's huge anyway. And that was also from the same family from little old PEI. Not quite as happy an ending to this story. I would call those monkey wrenches, and other people call them actually call them Stilson wrenches. They were invented here on PEI down in a place called Uig, U-I-G-G, down in the eastern end of the island. Interestingly, we have UIGG here on PEI. That's a name that they brought over from the Isle of Skye, where it's UIG. Now, why they added an extra G, I don't know. But anyway, in the 1850s, he invented that wrench, and there was an American delegation came up to PEI to try and talk us into joining the New England states. And so they were traveling around the island, and one of the local men said, well, why don't you drop into this fellow's blacksmith shop, because he's a very smart fella. And so they went in, and one of the gentlemen there actually noticed the wrench. That's what it looked like back in the day. And he asked if he could actually buy the wrench. And Mr. McCluskey gave him the wrench and said, you take it with you. The fellow went down to the States, and he patented it, because it hadn't been patented yet, and he patented it. He sent $300 up to McCluskey. That man's name was Stilson. And so that wrench became the Stilson wrench, and Mr. McCluskey made a total of $300 out of the whole deal. They're still selling them in the hardware stores. One of the other feel-good stories, and I've got countless stories about people chewing tobacco. A lot of times they only chewed it once. That was my case, because nobody told me not to swallow. That was invented here on the island, because back in the day, when you go back 100 years, if you're working in the barn or out making hay or whatever, it was hard to have a cigarette going, or even your pipe. And of course, you couldn't have a pipe going if you're thrashing grain out in the barn or whatever. And a lot of people chewed tobacco, and of course, it also kept your membranes kind of moist when there was an awful lot of smut on the wheat back in those days, and it'd be blowing out with the straw. I was lucky enough to interview this gentleman here on the right. His name was Bob Nicholson, and he was the last of the Nicholsons to run the Hickey and Nicholson factory in downtown Charlottetown. I brought with me, when I went to visit him, I brought a can with me that was called Rival, and I had just noticed when I was going to see him that on the side it said it was made by the Hickey and Nicholson Tobacco Company here on the island. And I said, why did you have, when everybody chewed the Hickey and Nicholson brand, why did you have to have this? And the reason was because they also sold on the mainland, where there was a lot more competition. And he said mainlanders didn't like as much molasses in their chewing tobacco. And so they made a less sweet chewing tobacco, and as a joke, they actually called it Rival, because they were, in effect, their own rivals. And here's the competition that they were putting up with. There were so many different companies over on the mainland. So that was the reason behind that. Now, I don't know if anybody's ever seen the Pictou twist. Well, it just happens I'm from Pictou County, Nova Scotia. And this is the Pictou twist. Jill said, don't do that, but you thought she was red before. Now she's really red. All right. Now, one thing we didn't invent is moonshine, but boy, we know how to make it. And I've drunk moonshine all over the Maritimes, and there's nothing like island shine. It is the best. The one thing islanders have down pat is how to make shine. So much so that it was even made in places where you just couldn't imagine. Here's my point. This fellow here, Ralph Gallant, from up the western end of the island, he was from Duvar. A Second World War veteran. He was a coal miner. He married a coal miner's daughter. And he learned from his father, who was a master moonshine maker and what we would now call a horse whisperer. He actually learned from him how to train horses. And both he and his father were famous in that end of the island for their treatment of horses. They could tame anything. So anyway, he came home from the war and he went to Minto, New Brunswick, and he mined coal for a while, and he fell in love with a coal miner's daughter. They mined coal in Alberta. He got black lung. You could just kind of see the tubes going down his nose there, and they wound up coming back to the island in the early 1950s, and he didn't have a job. He had 10 kids, and he wasn't able to provide properly for them. So he went back into the moonshine business, one thing he knew how to do well, and of course he got caught, and he landed a 6-month sentence in the Prince County Jail. Now at the time, the sheriff in Prince County was this fellow here, Bob Doer. You can just see Bob with the arrow above him. And the star is his daughter, Catherine. This is out by Reed's Corner on the way into Summerside. And he had a Studebaker dealership, even though his daughter told me he always drove a Buick. But anyway, I guess that wasn't good advertising. But he also had racehorses, and so he knew Ralph was in the jail. In fact, he was the one who arrested him. And he would go pick Ralph up every morning around 8 o'clock, and he would take him out to the racetrack where he would work on the sheriff's horses all day, training the horses around the track. And then he'd go back at 5 o'clock, and he'd pick him up, and he'd take him home to his own home, where he would go in with his wife Amelia and the 10 kids, and he'd have supper with them. And then he'd lie down on the couch beside the stove in the kitchen and have a little snooze. And then Bob Doer would show up at 7 o'clock and pick him up to take him back to the jail. So I said, in the interview, well, why even bother going back to the jail? You were out all day. Why even bother? It'd just be as easy to stay home. Well, he said, I had to go back to check my moonshine still. He was allowed to set up a moonshine still in the furnace room of the Prince County Jail. So he was going back to check his still. And so on the tape, you hear me say, oh, come on, Ralph. Now, you've told me a lot of stories today. That's just one too far. And his wife, Amelia, I could hear her out in the kitchen. I could hear the pots and pans going. She was listening to every word we said. She came rushing into the living room, and she grabbed the microphone out of my hand, and she said, every word that man said is true. She said, I had to go to the judge and say, please let my husband out of jail. He's becoming an alcoholic. Speaking of liquor, now we do a talk every fall in Trackety Cross. Yeah, that's right, it is Trackety Cross. And it's in this house here, actually, which is a big, huge brick house. That barn, sadly, is gone. But it was owned by the McDonald family and then by the McKinnons, and they were famous runners in that end of the island. So we go every year. They have what they call the Rum Runners Festival, and they bring in music, and I do a talk and whatever. And so the first year we were there a few years ago, I did a little talk in a room like this, and I said, so I told my stories, and I said, does anybody else have a story? And the oldest lady in the room got up and said, I've got one for you. Now she was from what we call the north side here on the island. That's up around Campbell's Cove and St. Margaret's and Clear Springs. That was the end of the island where she was from, and her job every day when she was a little girl was to go down to the pasture that ran right down to the water, right down to the Gulf, and get the cows and take them into milk. So one Sunday morning she went down, and she noticed on the beach, all across the beach, were all these 5-gallon kegs of rum. Now, obviously, one of the rum runners had been chased by the Alma or one of the other prohibition vessels. And they jettisoned their load with the idea of coming back later to pick it up. And they had all kinds of tricks, but obviously the Ullman was close because they just tossed them in and they washed up on the shore. So she went home with the cows and she told her parents, and they said, well, we don't have time now, but anyway, get in the way and we're all going to church. So they landed at church, and she could hear her parents whispering to all the people around them and saying, and telling them what the daughter had seen that morning. And so in the service, when the priest turns his back on the congregation to do the ad orientem, when he turned back around, this is what he saw. Everybody had cleared out. That was enough Christianity for one day. Let's have a drink. Now on our way up today, we went through Hampshire, and there's a graveyard in Hampshire, and I'll mention it again in a second. But anyway, I put this in because Shakespeare wrote this: "Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones." And that's, I thought that was appropriate, because if you go to Lorne Valley, there's a very old church there that in 1891 was moved about 2 miles down the road and reset. And then after they had their first service in the church, that Sunday afternoon, everybody went down and they dug up their ancestors' bones in the old graveyard, and they loaded them into baskets and took them down, and everyone's reburied in the new graveyard. The only other graveyard I ever heard that happening to is the one in Hampshire. Now the church is gone in Hampshire, but if you go into the graveyard, you'll notice there's lots of new graves, but there's also graves in that graveyard that predate the movement of the church. So a rather unusual thing to do, but I understand why you do it. You might as well have all your loved ones next to the church. This fellow here was the richest man on PEI one time. He was one of the Monaghan Irish out in the Fort Augustus Donagh area, and just on about 15, not even, about probably 12 miles east of Charlottetown. And he came here with absolutely nothing in his pocket. And he became the wealthiest man on PEI. And in fact, there's scholarships still given out at UPEI to both male and female students there. That is money, because he gave millions to what was at the time St. Dunstan's. And if you go downtown Charlottetown, right on at the bottom of Queen Street is the Canton Cafe. And if you look up at the top of the Canton Cafe, there's a bust. There's a big half statue, and it's him. That's on top of the Canton Cafe. That was one of the buildings, many buildings he owned in Charlottetown. So when they ran out of room in downtown Charlottetown, out near Birchwood, all the Catholic graveyards were getting full, and so they needed a new graveyard, and they were looking for something out in what at the time was out in the country in Parkdale. And he happened to own a field out where where St. Pius X, where the church is now, and he donated that field to the Catholic Church, and they built a new church on that property, and they started a new graveyard out there. So at the time, the acting bishop was a fellow by the name of Father Alex McGilvery, and he went out and he consecrated the ground, this field, so that it would be proper burials. He went back to the bishop's palace in Charlottetown and died. And by default became the first person buried in that graveyard, oddly enough. And obviously well loved. That was his, his tombstone was paid for by the parishioners of the church. In that same graveyard, just down from Father Alex's, is what is the largest graveyard, this island sandstone graveyard. And it's the Jenkins grave, and those Jenkinses would have been from the Cherry Valley area, and they would have been Heinkel. They were German. We don't have a lot of Germans on PEI, but we do have a few in that end of the island, names like Ballum. Acorn was Eichen, and it was changed, so all those names, and the other one was Jenkins. In the First World War, there was a Dr. Stephen Jenkins, and he had a son, Dr. Jack Jenkins, and Dr. Jack, when the First World War broke out, went over to England to work in the hospitals over there, looking after the wounded soldiers. There he met a young, vivacious, very wealthy lady who was a nurse and was driving ambulances. She was from Philadelphia, and her name was Weiss, and they fell in love and they get married, and he brought her back to PEI. She was a little bit bored with PEI, and she decided that she wanted to fly an airplane. And so the idea was that she had lots of money, so they went up to the Havilland plant in Toronto, and she picked out the airplane she wanted. Fleet Canuck, and she wanted CFPEI as the call letters on it, and they said, well, you can't have that because you have to have a number in there. Well, she didn't care. Her father-in-law, Dr. Stephen, had some pull, and she wound up getting CFPEI, and you'll see her plane in a second. But she became the island's first female pilot. She flew all over the place. I've got people on tape, and I would ask them, when did you see your first airplane? And half of them said, you're not going to believe this, there was a woman flying it. Even back then it was unusual, but she flew all the time, and she was absolutely fearless, and she still holds speed records for that type of airplane between Montreal and Charlottetown. So her and her husband built what was known as Upton Farm, right at the top of the hill out by the West Royalty Industrial Park. In fact, where everybody walks their dogs, you can still see the remnants of 2 runways there. And that was the hangar. It just fell in about 3 years ago. Sadly, it should have been saved. It was the first hangar on PDI, but anyway, it wasn't saved. It fell in. And it became known as Upton Airport. And there were flights coming in from Montreal, St. John, Moncton, and Halifax all the time. Now, this is a plane being loaded up. You can see there's mail and stuff going in, and it's on its way to the Maggies, because they also flew to the Maggies as well. And they would bring back patients and things like that, anyone needing to go to a hospital. So this is from a 1932 Patriot newspaper in Charlottetown, and you can see it was the Canadian Airways, and on all the airplanes was a goose. They had a goose, that was their symbol. And here's just a few of the pilots out there. The fellow with the star over, his name was Junior Jones, and he was from Moncton originally. He was a pilot in the First World War, and he came back and he did what they called barnstorming, and he would go around and land in a farmer's field, and he would take you up for what they called a flip, and it would cost you $5, and you go up for 10 minutes and fly around, and it was very exciting back in the 1920s and 30s to do something like that. And there you can see the CFPEI. She sold that airplane in the end. Her family made her sell it in the end. Her daughters were pretty embarrassed having this mother who was all gallivanting around in an airplane all the time. So she sold the airplane to a priest at St. Yves, who, by coincidence, his name was Father McGilvery as well, and he picked her up years later when she was an older woman, and the two of them flew it to Ottawa, and that plane is now hanging in the air in the Canadian Aviation Museum in Ottawa at the airport. And I have to thank this fellow here. That's my good friend, a fellow by the name of Garnet Godfrey. Originally from Moncton, came from a railway family, and was a disgrace to his family because he wanted to be a pilot. There he is firing up a biplane. This guy flew biplanes, and he lasted with his pilot's license into the 1960s, and he flew jets. So he covered the whole gamut of aviation. Thank you very much, Joe. Thank you very much. Now, I'm sure everybody has seen this movie. It's well known. It was made in the 1960s, The Great Escape, and all kinds of big names and stars in it. But there's a PEI connection to this. And it's this fellow here. Now, this fellow here, his name, he was John Riley. He was a Spitfire pilot in the Second World War. He was from Bell River here in the island, down on the way to Wood Islands. And in fact, when you drive through Bell River, there were 2 houses across from each other, and each of them was a general store, and they were owned by Riley brothers. And so they were their own rivals, going back to the rivals again. But anyway, he was shot down in 1943, and he wound up in Stalag Luft 3. He actually tried to escape, so they watched him very carefully, which is why when the Great Escape happened later on, he wasn't even there. He'd been shipped out, but he was there while the tunnels were being dug. So I went to interview him, and he was very modest about himself. He didn't want to talk about it. But one thing he said was that a friend of his had died, and he was the real hero behind the Great Escape. And it was a fellow by the name of Wally Floody, Floody, and he was a hard rock miner from, I think, up in northern Ontario somewhere. I can't remember where exactly. But he was the real hero anyway. And so, because he was the brains behind the tunnels, they were named Tom, Dick, and Harry. And they didn't care if the Germans found Tom and Dick, but they didn't want them to find Harry. That was the real secret one. But he was the brains behind it, and he figured out how to shore up the tunnels and all that stuff. So anyway, so I put his story on the radio, you know, John Riley, and then we hopped in an airplane and we flew over to Britain, Jill and I and our 2 kids and Jill's mom, who was living with us at the time. And we headed over and we went up to the Lake District, and we were all pretty tired. It was a rough journey, and the one thing that my wife Jill loves more than anything else is French fries. She loves her chips, and England's famous. You can always get a good feed of chips over there. So we were all sitting around, and about 5 to 8 on a Sunday night, Jill decided that she needed some comfort food, and would I go get her some chips? So I said, sure. So I go out the door and I went down. We were in a place called Ambleside in the Lake District, and I went down to the first chippy I came to, and the guy was just closing it up, and he said, no, he said, the fat's off. He said, there's nothing. He said, but there's another fella down the street, and he may be able to help you. So I went down, ran down to the next place, and sure enough, the guy had one last load of chips. He grabbed a newspaper and threw the chips in, folded it up, and gave it to me, and I came home and gave it to the redhead, and she was eating away. Now, I read everything I got my hands on. I've read every cereal box that was ever made. And so I opened up this dirty old greasy newspaper that was months old, and I'm flipping through it, and look what I found. I found the obituary to Wally Floody. What are the odds that that would be the one newspaper that guy would grab out of a pile? And there it is there, explaining, and nothing in the papers here in Canada, but in Britain, they recognized their war heroes. So there was a beautiful obituary written up to him, and here he is here, holding a photograph of him. He was also a Spitfire pilot. He got shot down in 1941. Just like John Riley, he got transferred out just before everybody tried to escape. 76 POWs escaped. Only 3 ever got away. 2 of them made it back to England. 1 only got as far as France. 73 were recaptured, and on Hitler's orders, 50 were lined up against the wall and shot. Just to show that, and of course word got through to all the other stall hogs in the area, don't try and escape because you're going to wind up dead. He was awarded the OBE by the Brits in 1962. He was also asked to be the tech advisor on that movie, on The Great Escape. At the time, John Riley was taking graduate courses. He was a banker, and he was taking graduate courses in finance at UCLA. He got a phone call from Wally Floody. He said, "Come on down to MGM, and I'll show you all around." He said, "I'm the technical advisor on the movie." In the end, he was written out of the movie, even though they had him on the set. It was a Polish pilot, was the hero of the movie, not Wally Floody, that was played by Charles Bronson. So when you watch the movie, when you watch Charles Bronson, you're really watching Wally Floody. Why wasn't I taught that in school? Those are the kinds of things we should be taught in school, in my opinion. And one of the other things that I was always curious about, because we're all immigrants to this country, or not all, but I mean most of us are. And I often wonder, what was it like on the way over, and what did they leave behind, and did they ever go back, and things like that. So I was lucky enough many years ago to interview this lady. Her name was Annie Byrne. She never married. She was born in 1897. She lived to be 109 years old, and when she was 103, I went to interview her. And she told me about her Grammy Rose Clarkin, and her Grammy Rose Clarkin lived to be 100 years old herself, and so their lives overlapped enough that she actually asked the questions I would have liked to ask Rose Clarkin. And she was 9 years old when they left in 1835, one of the Monaghan Irish again, out in the Fort Augustus, Lake Bird area. One of the stories she told her that although they lived almost 12 miles from Charlottetown, and at the time there was no bridge, of course, in those days, and all the kids were allowed to go to town once a year, and they had to carry their boots until they got almost to the harbor, and they could see the spires of the churches, and then they were allowed to put their boots on, and they would go into town and do their shopping and whatever, and then get back on Wisner's little ferry, and it was a paddle wheeler that went back and forth where the bridge is now, and there was a horse walking in a circle going round and round, and he was driving the paddle wheel. Wisner, another one of those Germans I mentioned. When they were out of sight of the steeples of Charlottetown, then they had to take their boots off again, and they walked the 12 miles back to Lake Bird. And she also told her granddaughter that they lived 200 yards from Lake Bird. They lived there a number of years, and suddenly one of her brothers ran in the house and said, "I found the ocean, I found the ocean." And they went out and it was Lake Verde. They've been living there for years and had no idea it was there, the trees were that thick. And the other thing she told her was her father and her brothers had to stay up at night and keep fires going all the time to scare the bears away, otherwise the bears would get their cattle and their pig. So, she lived to be 100 years old, and this is what she told her granddaughter, what the food was for the 7 or 8 week voyage. 250 pounds of oatmeal or cornmeal, 650 pounds of potatoes, 50 pounds of biscuits, 20 pounds of butter, 1 gallon of molasses, 20 pounds of bacon, 50 pounds of salt herring, a small amount of vinegar, 1 gallon of rum, and if you wanted sugar or tea, you had to pay extra. And each adult received 5 pints of water a day, and that was it. And they were also given a small bottle of peppermint oil. And so Annie asked her grandmother, "Why were you given peppermint oil?" And she said, after a week out in the ocean, the water in the barrels was so rancid, and you were putting it in your porridge and everything else, that you had to put drops of peppermint oil in, otherwise you couldn't drink it. So that's what life was like when you came to BEI. Around the same time, I did some interviews out in the Marshfield area, out in the Marshfield and Dunstaffanage area, and there's Robertson's family there that came from Blair Athol, which is dead square in the middle of Scotland, and they came across in 1818 on a vessel, and on the voyage across, they actually spotted a dead whale floating that had been harpooned and left to die. Obviously, it swam away, and the whalers weren't able to get it. So they grappled onto it and they towed it into Charlottetown, and they made enough money when they sold the blubber that they were able to bring more of their family over. So that was one way, I guess, of bringing any of the immigrants to PEI. On that same voyage was a family that settled in T Hill on the other side of the river. I interviewed a fellow by the name of Bob McCrae, and he showed me a letter that was sent from Blair Athol, and it had been written up and down, or across, and then they turned it 90 degrees and wrote up and down, and then they turned it 45-degree angle and they wrote sideways on it, because you were charged by the weight, not by the content. And he said those letters used to come to a family in Connell known as the 60 Weeks McDonald's. And I said, why were they called that? And he said, well, a letter would arrive on a sailing vessel into Charlottetown, and they would let everybody know over on the other side of the river, because there was family in Marshfield, Dunstaffanage, plus the ones in T Hill and Connell, all from the same area of Scotland. They would let everybody know that one of the letters had arrived from home. Everybody would congregate in the McDonald's house, and they would read the letter with all the information. And you can imagine trying to read that with all the information. So and so is dead. So and so is married. So and so is buried, or whatever. And then with everybody in the room, they in turn would write a letter back to send back on the vessel going back to Scotland. It took 60 weeks for the letter to go from Charlottetown to Scotland, and Scotland back to PEI. So they were known as the 60 Weeks McDonald's. Not just letters, of course, went back and forth. This is one of the things that I thought was pretty amazing. We fly now and you're told all your luggage must fit underneath the seat in front of you. But believe it or not, this family here brought their own tombstone over with them. Now, if you go to the Free Church of Scotland in Cape Traverse, in behind that church is that gravestone, and it's for a fellow by the name of Thomas Crothers, and his wife was Isabella Tate. They came here around 1800, and they weren't sure that they were going to get a proper Christian burial on the PEI, so they brought their own tombstone with everything chiseled out on it except their death date. I thought that was unusual, and I have found 2 other families did exactly the same thing. One family in York and one family on Big Island in Pictou County, Nova Scotia, also brought their own over. I was a little suspicious when I was told that story, and it just happened my family came from exactly the same area as those Crotherses. Jill and I were doing the family tree one time in Dumfriesshire. This is, you can see all the stone, there's stone everywhere, and my main love in life is rocks, and so I'm kind of an amateur geologist, there's all kinds of quarries in that area, and I went out to one of the quarries where I was told where that tombstone came from. The quarry is still operating, and it's exactly the same siltstone as that gravestone was made out of, so the story's true. Plus I ran into a Judge George Crothers, I guess who also confirmed the story, and I guess if you can't believe a judge, then you've got a problem. What's interesting, this is my family who left from that area where the church was, and I'm very fortunate to have one of the very few, because you didn't have to keep a manifest of the passengers until the 1860s if the ship leaving the British Isles was going to one of the British colonies. So it just happens that the Lovely Nelly on the voyage of 1774, for whatever reason, the captain kept a very accurate record of the passengers on the list, and the first two names on the list are my ancestors. He was a blacksmith and a whitesmith, and they came to PEI in 1774. You can see at the top they only lasted 2 years, because the 1770s here in the island were known as the decade of the mice. There was all kinds of mice all over the island eating the crops, and a lot of people left in the late 1870s, which is how my family wound up in Pictou County. And of course, back then, in 1774, we had lots of bears here on the island as well as in Nova Scotia. And we know that for a fact because we have place names like Bear River PEI. It was named after a 400-pound bear fought this fellow by the name of Roderick MacDonald in 1840. And Roderick MacDonald actually killed the bear, which I don't know if I believe that or not. Why isn't it called MacDonald River? Called Bear River, so that indicates to me. And that's a photo of the Marconi station on the left. You can see the mast there, and that's the Cape Bear lighthouse. It's still there, and it's all grown up now. You wouldn't know it was the same. And that is where the first distress signal of the Titanic, when it was sinking, that was the first place in Canada that picked up the signal by a fellow by the name of Tom Harris was the keeper. And just out the road from us in Mount Herbert was this tree always known as the bear tree. It's in a big field, I would guess a 20-acre field at least. And in the middle of that field for years and years was a single tree. That was because the Mutches came here as loyalists in the 1780s. And they weren't here a year, and a 12-year-old girl went out to play in the woods, and she was killed by a bear. And so they left a tree in memory of her, always in the middle of that field. When they cleared everything all out, one tree was always left. Now when you go there, unfortunately, it's gone, and it's not been replanted, which I think is a shame. I know of 4 other families here on PEI that had ancestors killed and eaten by bears. So it wasn't uncommon at the time. Now the last bear on PEI was shot in 1927 up on the Surrey Line Road. They were shot by a fellow by the name of Geordie Leslie, who was a boxer, and he went on, moved to Toronto, and he became the doorman at the King Eddie Hotel. I don't know if anybody ever stayed at the King Eddie, but anyway, it was in the middle of winter, and it was easy to track the bear because of the prints in the snow. And that's his nephew there, and when he was growing up as a young fella, there was a bear skin always in the living room, and it got, as the kids were playing with it, it got smaller and tattier, and it's gone now as well. But one of the things he told me was the bear was rendered down, it was boiled down, and they were able to skim off 10 pounds of bear fat, bear grease, and I don't know how they knew this, but it was shipped to England, and they were paid $1 a pound for it. And to this very day, if you kill a bear, and I know this because I've got family in Nova Scotia, if you kill a bear, you can do the same thing. There's still people buying bear grease in England to use. They mix it with all kinds of things. It's the same as emu oil. Remember emu oil was supposed to go through the skin and for arthritis or rheumatism? Well, apparently bear grease has the same characteristics. All right, we're going to go from the last bear to a first. In this case, the first female lighthouse keeper in Canada is this lady right here, Maisie Lamont Adams, born in 1913 in French River. And she was a great lady. I got to know her really well because she wound up working on a TV series I was working on, and she was absolutely adored. But anytime I needed any information from the New London area, I go visit Maisie, and she knew everybody's business. She was absolutely amazing. There's the lighthouse that she ran. The fellow that ran the lighthouse, a fellow by the name of Jack McCrae, had been a First World War veteran, but when the Second War broke out, he decided to give up the lighthouse. He moved his family out, and he signed up again and wound up in Burma in charge of mules, if you can believe that or not. But anyway, it was Maisie and her husband Claude were the ones who took over the lighthouse. And right away, Claude got sick with cancer. He was sick. He died in 1943, but he was sick for 4 years. And so Maisie essentially did the work of the lighthouse keeper. She was lugging oil up to the top of the lighthouse to actually feed the main light, and then there was a range light a quarter of a mile down the beach, and she had to lug. She was only this big, and she had to lug these 5-gallon cans of oil down and load up the range light every day as well. So when Claude died in 1943, who arrives at her door but the lighthouse inspector from the Department of Transport, a fellow by the name of McNutt. And he said, you're going to have to move out. You and the 3 kids are going to have to go because we can't have a female running the lighthouse. Now she said, you know that I've been running this lighthouse, so you know I can do the job, so I'm not leaving. And he said, well, leave it with me, I'll go to bat for you. So this is the letter he wrote to go to bat for her, saying that she was able to carry on, which as a result allowed her to become the first official female lighthouse keeper in Canada. And this is, when she got a raise right away, I don't know what happened, I guess the middle of the war, they used to leave those lights on, the one in Cape Tryon, because we had air bases here, and when they flew out over the Gulf, they would use those range lights or use those lighthouses even in the wintertime as a beacon when they were flying back to the island. So she got a raise. She was making $16 a month. She was only being paid for the 8 months that she was working, and she got a big raise up to $180 a year. So you can imagine raising 3 kids on that. She always told me if it hadn't been for family and friends, she never would have made it. Everyone looked after her. And there she is there, all dolled up. She's got more white on her face, all this white powder on her face. She was 85 years old there. And that's Michael Enright. He used to be on CBC Radio on Sunday mornings, and he was one of the special guests. When we were shooting Emily of New Moon, every episode they would bring in a star or a name, and it was Michael Enright. So I got talking to him one day, and I said, I got someone I want you to meet. I said, and I want you to put her on the radio. I had her on the radio 100 times. Anyway, he said, well, he didn't want to, he was down to have some fun, right? The minute he met her, boy, that was it. I was in the car with the 2 of them. He was in costume, and she was dressed like that. And I introduced them, and she started talking to him. And he told me to get out of the car. He wanted to interview her right then and there. So she wound up being on the national program. I think the following Sunday. Now, just down the road from her, this fella here, this is Tommy Gallant, and he's holding the anchor chains. You can just kind of make out. Whoops. You can just kind of make out the chain there. That's one of them there. They were made into bookends. And he's the guy that found the Marco Polo. Now, the Marco Polo was built in 1851 in St. John, and it was a clipper ship. It was the fastest vessel on the ocean at the time. It started off hauling grain and stuff from Australia to Britain, and then they realized that they could load in, that they could actually make more money hauling immigrants from Britain down to Australia. So it was on the way down it was immigrants, and on the way back it was grain or whatever, gold or whatever they could load in. And by 1883, she was on her. That's 30 years is a long life in a vessel, and so she was on her last legs, and she was loaded up with lumber from Quebec on her way, I think on her way to Britain, and she hit a storm outside Cavendish, and so on purpose the captain drove it into New London Harbor, where she hit a sandbar and went over on her side. So all the people in the area gathered, and then they were all looking out. And Tommy Gallant's father was Henry Gallant. Henry was a fisherman. He was only getting $1.50 a pound for a salt cod, and that was cod split and salted. He was getting $1.50 a pound. And so he became a run runner because he had a big family, and that was one way of making money. He was getting $15 or $3 a gallon he was paying that for his, and then he was selling it for 30. And he had a 47-foot schooner. But when Henry was a little boy, he and his father were standing on the shore looking at the Marco Polo over on her side being torn to pieces by the wind and everything. And his father said to young Henry, "You remember where that vessel is, and someday you'll be the only one who will remember." And so Henry passed that information on to his son Tommy, and he said, "Every time you sail out the harbor or out the bay, you have a look, because using points on land as marks," he said, "you look around in that area, because that's where that vessel is." Of course, there were storms, and there have been 100 storms since then that washed all the sand over on top of the wreck. So every time Tommy went out, he looked and looked and looked. And wouldn't you know it, 100 years almost to the day, in 1983, he was sailing out, clear water. There had been a storm the night before, and the water had cleared up perfectly. And he looked down and he saw a glint right where his father told him to look, and it was a porthole from the Marco Polo. So he went back, he went up to the air base in Summerside, and he knew a fellow up there who was a deep sea diver, and he said to him, I'll split anything with you. I think I found the Marco Polo. So he went down and he brought up a porthole, and he brought up those chains and a few other little bits and pieces. But the main thing they found was the anchor, and it was a huge anchor, you can imagine, off the Marco Polo. So with great huge amount of work, they managed to get it into Tommy's boat, and they brought it in on shore, and Tommy decided he was going to sell tickets to see it. So he had a sign at the end of his driveway in French River, $5 to see the anchor of the Marco Polo, a little handwritten sign. He said that didn't work out, so after a year or two of doing that, he decided he'd sell it. Now, it was verified by one of the professors at UNB in St. John, who was an expert on vessels, especially vessels built in St. John. So he was extremely interested when word got back to him that someone had found the wreck of the Marco Polo. So he showed up, and he absolutely 100% verified it was the anchor from the Marco Polo. Word got back to the Irvings in St. John, and they offered to buy it from Tommy. Now, he wanted $1,000 for it, and they beat him down to $300. This is the Irvings. They beat him down to $300, and they said, if you bring it over to St. John in the back of your half-ton truck, we'll even pay an extra $60. So Tommy, being the nicest guy in the world, you can never meet a sweeter man in your life, loaded this thing in the back of his truck that weighed tons, and drove all the way to St. John, drove into the Irving's compound on the outskirts of St. John with big gates on it, that locks on it, and went in, and they unloaded it. He was given his $360 and told to beat it. He said it wrecked his truck. Now, if you want to see the anchor of the Marco Polo, you've got to be a good friend of the Irvings, because it's not open to the public. So that's what happens to our heritage. If you have enough money, you can buy it. And of course, Maisie would have known Tommy and his father Henry very well, because she was the lighthouse keeper there. And she said there'd be a big storm brewing, and she said every other fisherman would be heading back into port as fast as they could. And she looked out of the corner of her eye, and she see Tommy and Henry sailing out, going out. Everybody else coming in, and they were going out to haul their nets or whatever. And she said, I worried more about Tommy than I did anybody else. I just worried myself sick, worried that I was going to find his body washed up on shore. But she said, every time he sailed past her lighthouse, she'd throw a codfish for her. So she had something to feed the kids. Sticking with the sea, this is a couple Jill and I got to know really well. This is Captain Tom Trenham and his wife Mary, who was first mate on his schooners for years. Now, he was a schooner man, just like his father. His father was Captain William Trenham. They're from Port Elgin originally, but he wound up in Georgetown and then finally in Murray Harbor. And he was the last of the schooner men, not only on the island, but I suspect he was the last of the schooner men in the Maritimes, because he was sailing schooners right into the late 1960s. he had never been on shore before because he was raised on a vessel with his mother, who had been a school teacher, and his father, who taught the 3 boys and the daughter how to play the fiddle and the piano at night, and the mother gave them lessons at night. So when he was 17, he landed in Lewisburg, and his father bought the old lighthouse owned by the Cann, C-A-N-N family. And his father bought the lighthouse. He didn't last long as a landlubber. They were only there 2 years. And then he decided he didn't like it. He'd rather live on the schooner. So everybody packed up. By then, Tom was 19 and she was 17, and they got married. So this is Mary on her honeymoon. I mean, look at the boots. Look at the boots. And that isn't her wedding dress, but her family had absolutely no money whatsoever. There she is, proud as punch, on her honeymoon, heading down to British Guyana, down in South America. And you can see the lumber on the deck behind her. And it was a big vessel. I'll actually show you a photograph in a second. It was a vessel known as the Marion Beowulf. It was a schooner. Old Captain William used to put the #1 stuff down in the hold. It was always pine. He would put the #2 stuff that only cost half as much on the deck. And if they made it all the way down to Barbados or British Guyana or Jamaica or whatever, without hitting a storm, all the lumber on the deck was what Tom called the gravy. That was the extra money that they would make. And if they actually hit a storm and it got washed overboard, well, at least the good stuff was down in the hold. So there she is with it there. Now there's the Marion Beowulf 2 years later. She had been sold. And a Newfoundlander had bought her, and he was sailing into port in the Port of Basque area, and he came across a house about 15 miles out at sea, and he hooked onto the house and he towed it back in. That's the Marion Beowulf, and that's the house, because in 1929 we had in the Gulf of St. Lawrence the 3rd biggest earthquake in Canadian history, and the south shore of Newfoundland was swamped. There were, as you can read, there were 27 died. In that house, in fact, when they examined it, there was a mother and two children in the upstairs room dead. They drowned after they towed it back in. This fella here is also Newfoundlander. He's from the Burin area, from Burin Bay Arm, which is also on the South Shore, and he told me one of the best stories ever. When the tidal wave hit that area, it lifted a general store right up underneath and floated it across the road and set it down in a field. And as he said, it never even broke. There was a whole shelf of globes that they used on the kerosene lamps, and not a globe, and it broke. And the guy that owned the store went to the guy that owned the field and said, "I'll swap you the old where the store used to be. You give me that field." And he just carried on as if life was normal. All they had to do was add a couple of sets of stairs, and he was back in business. And this lady here, I got to know. She was from a place called the Messers, which is near Burgeo, just down the road from Burin. And there was a house, there was another house from her village that washed out to sea, and it washed back in again the next day on the tide, and the mother was dead, but the baby upstairs in the crib survived, and was raised by her mother. Actually, her mother was a midwife in that area. All right, we're going to head to the air. I don't know if anybody remembers MCA, Maritime Central Airways, but it was started up by an islander. But first, sorry, I didn't mean to off topic here. If you go to this little church, not very far from here, in Springbrook, not very far from New London, you can see one thing's unusual right off the bat is that it has a bell tower that's separate from the church, which is very unusual to see. Inside on the door of that bell tower, on the 24th of June in 1936, 6 men were digging a grave for a Mrs. Beaton when the Hindenburg flew over. And so they recorded it on the inside of the door. And you can still go to that church and open up the bell tower door, and that is still written on the inside of the door. So they marked it down. So I saw that years ago, and then when I started interviewing people, I started asking, did you ever see the Hindenburg? And I was shocked at how many people saw the Hindenburg in the 1930s as it was flying over the island. And it would scare the cattle, scare the chickens. The hens wouldn't lay for 2 days and the cows wouldn't give milk, a lot of fellas told me, because this big shadow they'd see and it was like a hawk or whatever. But a lot of people saw the swastikas on the tail of it was flying that low. And then of course in May 1937 it caught fire as it was docking in Lakehurst, New Jersey. Now this, getting back to MCA, this is the fellow that actually started the MCA. A fellow by the name of Carl Burke. He was from Sherwood, he was from Parkdale rather, which is now part of Charlottetown. Absolutely amazing pilot. He was in what they call Ferry Command in the Second World War. They were building planes in Amherst, Nova Scotia, and in Ontario, Quebec. And he would go up and he would fly a plane from here to Newfoundland, and then from Newfoundland to Scotland or to Ireland or wherever for the war effort. And then after the war in the 1960s, he started up Maritime Central Airways, which eventually morphed into Eastern Provincial Airways, and then Eastern Provincial Airways became the cornerstone of what is now Air Canada. So it was all started here on the island with virtually nothing. In 1943, at the air base in Charlottetown, they were out doing patrols in the Gulf, and there was an ice storm, and one of the planes thought that the pilot of the Anson thought he was over land, and he thought he'd try and land, and instead he was in the middle of St. Peter's Harbor, and they didn't know how to rescue these guys out there. So they called Carl Burke, who was the best pilot around, and he flew out. He landed 5 times, I'm sorry, and he picked up all four of the crewmen, and he went back to get the cockpit, all the instruments in the cockpit as well. And then after the war, he flew supplies up to the Dew Line, probably one of the most dangerous jobs you could have done at that time. And he made enough money, which is when he started up MCA, which became Eastern Provincial. And interestingly, everybody knows that Banting and Best are the two scientists who invented or discovered insulin. And both of them have a connection to PEI, oddly enough. This is the McNichol. This house is in Cardigan, and it was owned by Dr. Best's son. I thought it was him, but it was a different. He had a son, Dr. Charles Best, as well, and he was one of the owners. There was a big, huge beef cattle operation in the eastern end of the island at what they call Dundas Farms, and he was one of the shareholders in that. And so he owned that house. So it's the son of the Dr. Charles. And then the other connection, oddly enough, again has to do with Carl Burke, because Dr. Banting was a scientist of great renown, and he had a lab at the University of Michigan or Wisconsin, I can't remember which one, but anyway, he was working in the war on a flight suit that pilots and crew could wear at high altitudes. And it was to keep them warm. And the idea was they could fly out of range of the German flak and the guns on the ground when they were doing their bombing missions. So he had worked on this for over a year, and he finally thought in 1943 that he finally had the problem solved. He hopped on a plane flown by one of the American pilots at the time, and they flew across the states, and as they were flying over Newfoundland, they developed engine trouble, and they crash landed on a frozen lake in the middle of nowhere in Newfoundland. And so what to do? Well, what do you do in times like that is you call Carl Burke. And so Carl Burke flew from Charlottetown over to Newfoundland with a ski plane. He was able to land on the lake, which was in itself was a feat. The only survivor was the pilot, a fellow who was in the American Air Force. And he was taken to Stephenville because the Americans had an air base there. And he was put in the hospital, but Banting was dead, as were the other crew members. And you can still go to this place now. It's in Musgrave Harbor, Newfoundland. There's the wreck of the plane, and there's the plane. That's the mate of the plane that actually flew up and brought the bodies out. But a rather odd connection to two very famous men. Now this lady here, her name was Minnie Langell. I interviewed her one afternoon, and her hands, you can see her hands never stopped. She was blind at the time, And I sat there for 4 hours and threw question after question after question at her. She answered every question and knit and hooked the whole time I was there. Absolutely amazing lady. And one of the questions, or one of the things I always asked, because here on the island we didn't get electricity until the late 50s out in the rural areas, unless you lived in Freetown or in Tryon or places, or in Bredelvins, another place where the guy that ran the mill might have hooked up a generator, and therefore you would have limited power in a small area. But for the most part it was Maritime Electric. So anyway, Minnie was in the 1950s. Her and her husband were living on a road with only 6 farms on it. And so Maritime Electric came along and they said, okay, we need all 6 people to sign up. And everybody said great. They had already gone out and bought radios and fridges and washing machines, and boy, this is going to be a great thing. The old fella at the end of the road, no way. The kerosene lamp was good enough for his grandfather. It was good enough for him, and he wasn't going to have anything to do with this newfangled electricity. And so this went on for a year, and everybody was chomping at the bit and getting a little bit upset that this old fellow wouldn't sign up. And finally his son got married, and the son and the new bride moved into the old farmhouse. And by God, the daughter-in-law, she was going to have electricity. So she insisted, and he said, all right. He said, you can have it as long as it's the smallest amount we can get. Now, at the time, and I know this for a fact because my grandfather was exactly the same way, and when my brother rewired the old farm, the old family house, he saved for me the 30 amp box. There were 2 15-amp fuses in a box. So that was enough to have one plug in the kitchen to plug in the radio to listen to the death notices at 12:30 and to Don Messer on Friday night. You could have one light in the kitchen, and there was the other 15-amp fuse would do one plug upstairs and one light going upstairs, and that was it. So I know for a fact that was the case. So that was all they had, and he said to his daughter-in-law, I want you to put in the smallest light bulb possible in the kitchen. And she said, it's a flat rate. We're going to pay $6 a month anyway. I don't care. He said, I want the smallest bulb possible. We're not wasting anything. So she had to put a 25-watt bulb in the kitchen. And this is a big old-fashioned farmhouse. And she said it was worse than the kerosene lamps. It was dark and she could almost cut her fingers off. So she waited a month. And of course, women being smarter than men, you know what's going to happen here. So she waited a month and didn't say a word to anybody. Oh, came the 25-watt bulb in, went a 40. Didn't say a word to anybody. Waited another month, oh, came the 40 in, went a 60-watt bulb. Didn't say a word to anybody. Waited another month, oh, came the 60 in, went a 75-watt bulb. Didn't say a word to anybody. Oh, comes the 75, in goes a 100-watt bulb. So 6 months later, they're all sitting around the table having supper one night, and the old fella turned to her and he said, you know, I think I might have been wrong about this electricity thing. I think it's making my eyes better. All right, one last story here. I'm sure everybody's ready for a bathroom break. This is Jill's dad. This is my father-in-law, and as you can see, I was his favorite son-in-law. So when the Second World War broke out, his father was the chief of police in Charlottetown. Everybody knew him as the old chief, Archie Burtwhistle, and he was a great old fella. But anyway, Ken was a young fella, and he signed up. Him and a fellow by the name of Jim Hornby went out, and they went into Henderson and Cudmore, which was even going when I was a kid. That's where you went to get Levi's and things like that. It was the hot place to go. But it was back then in 1939 as well. So they went into Henderson and Cudmore, the two of them, and they decided they were going to splurge. So they got new shoes, new socks, a new suit, vest, tie, shirt, hat, the whole 9 yards, and then went out and got drunk. And so the next morning, when the ship was leaving Charlottetown Harbor on its way to Halifax for the training in the Navy, his father walked by Ken's bedroom, and there was Ken lying in the suit with the hat all over his face, hung over. So he said, "Ken, get up. The ship's leaving the harbor." And he loaded him into the paddy wagon. Siren going, bells and whistles going, got him down to the harbor. They just got on the ship in time, and off he went to war. So he wound up on a vessel called the Prince Robert. Now there were what were known as the three princes. There was the David, the Henry, and the Robert, and they were all built on the west coast. and 2 of them wound up here. One of them wound up down in the Caribbean, and the other one wound up doing a convoy duty out of Halifax, and that's the one that Ken was assigned to. And he was a commander on the vessel, one of the officers on the vessel. So he would have done all these convoy duties back and forth, over to Londonderry and to Liverpool and Southampton, hauling supplies and whatever. And I mean, the stories you just wouldn't believe, because it was a heavily armed, what they call a heavily armed cruiser, and they were there to guard the convoy, and they were not allowed to stop no matter what. And one of the things that was going across all the time, of course, was oil and kerosene and gasoline for airplanes and tanks and jeeps and things like that. And he said more than once there'd be this huge explosion in front of them, and it was one of the tankers getting torpedoed, and the water would be on fire, and they would have to barrel through, men on fire, begging for help, but they were not allowed to stop, because if they stopped and the German U-boat got them, then everybody was going to be in trouble. He said it was terrible. And you can ask Jill. He never told her any of these stories. But when he found out I was interviewing other Second War veterans, he wanted to talk to me all of a sudden, and these are the stories he told me. So anyway, Ken winds up on the vessel, and then in 1945, early in 1945, it needed a refit, and rather than do it here, which all our shipyards were up to their neck in repairs and building, they decided to take it back out to Victoria, where the vessel had been built in the first place, and they would know how to do the reconditioning of the engines and things like that. So down they go through the Panama Canal, up the other side, up past California, into Victoria. While he's there, he goes to a Red Cross dance, and he meets this lady here, and that's Jill's mom. And they fell in love, and he said, I'll come back for you after the war. And that was the case. He came back, and that's his father-in-law, who had served in the First War as well, and then served in the Second War as well. Now, he served in the First War. He was in his last year as a medical student at McGill. And in the First World War, the first Commonwealth university to set up their own hospital was McGill. It was a Canadian General Hospital number 3, CGH number 3. And in charge of that hospital was a fellow that we all know well, this fellow right here, John McCrae, the guy that wrote Flanders Fields. And it just happened that he came in after after the second Battle of Ypres. He had come in. He had lost a dear friend, and he had written a poem in memory of his friend. And he walked in. Everyone was tired. They'd been working. You can imagine all the injuries and stuff. And he came in and he threw down a piece of paper on the table and said, "Boys, what do you think of this?" And it was Flanders Fields. And so her grandfather was there with them at the time so it was taken by one of the other doctors and sent over to a magazine in England, and it was published in England, and as a result it became famous. It became the poem of the First World War for the Allies. Interestingly, there's a second connection to PEI. Just go one more for me here. That little girl, remember the little girl back with Bob Doer at the Studebaker dealership? I had the star over her head. Well, she became a nurse, and she taught nursing here on the island, and she's also a wonderful author, a great historian. And she discovered that this nursing sister, Lillian Pigeon from Kensington, was one of 2 who nursed John McCrae on his deathbed. She was there. She was handpicked by him, her and a lady by the name of Mary Bliss. 72 nurses from McGill or from Montreal went over with the number 3 hospital, and 3 were Islanders, and she was one of the ones. And he knew her from his early days at McGill. John McCrae did. So, small world. You never know, do you? It's just unbelievable. So, well, whatever happened, so after the war, Jill's grandfather came back. He did his last year at McGill. He was valedictorian of his class. He graduated top of his class, so he was a surgeon. He could have gone anywhere in the world, and he did what a lot of the First World War veterans did. He got as far away from civilization as he could. And he took his family 900 miles due north underneath the Alaskan Panhandle, as far north as he could go in Canada, to this town that was being built, and it was a copper mining town. At one time, the largest copper smelter in the British Commonwealth, and you can just see it was a massive, massive town. Thousands of people lived there. They not only mined copper, they mined gold, they mined silver, they mined lead, but the main thing was copper. The only way in and out was by steamship. There was not a living thing for 50 miles because copper smelting means that you get the sulfur dioxide in the air and it kills everything. So one of the stories that Jill's grandmother told her was him going out to play golf on the slag heaps. And there wasn't a bit of grass anywhere. They played golf up there. But that's what he did. He wanted to get as far away, and he took his family up there. That's Jill's grandmother, Noni, for which Jill's first name is Nora, which is the same name as her. And then after it shut down in 1935, when the copper prices crashed, he moved his family back down to Victoria, or Vancouver, sorry, where he would see all these ex-miners and men and families that worked in the smelter up in Antioch. And because everything was free up there, they expected him to look after them for free in Vancouver, which he did. He died broke, he died young, and he drank, and he never got over the war. He was one of the many men that never got over that first war. And although he never talked about it, I'd be willing to guess as a third-year student, he wouldn't be allowed, even though he was training to be a surgeon. He wasn't doing the work of a doctor. And I'm willing to bet he spent that entire war sawing off arms and legs of people who had been wounded and they couldn't save them. That's my guess. That's what that man did. So, well, where are we? Well, we have Ken and Victoria, and so the ship is finally fixed. And it's all patched up, and so they're heading back down to the Panama Canal. And before they leave Victoria Harbor, on the 8th of May, 1945, VE Day was declared in Europe. So they were asked on the Prince Robert, will you volunteer? Because they actually couldn't make them go. Will you volunteer to go help the Americans in the Pacific? And to a man on the vessel, they said yes. And there was like, I don't know, 200 men and crew on the vessel. They said yes. So they started steaming towards Japan because the war was slowly coming to an end in the Pacific after Guadalcanal and all those other battles. And so on the way, they get halfway across the Pacific, and August comes, and the bombs are dropped on Nagasaki and on Hiroshima, so the war is over there as well. And they get new orders. Now they're to go to Hong Kong, because across the harbor from Hong Kong was a place called Kowloon. It fell. Hong Kong fell in 1940. There were Australians and Canadians and Brits there guarding the harbor, and the Japanese overran it, and they took these men and they literally turned them into slaves. I've interviewed 3 of them. I won't tell you the stories now, but one I will tell was the Japanese guards used to peel an orange and then throw the peelings in the middle of the floor to watch the men fight over the peelings. That's what was going on. Anyway, so when they land there, they were told that this is what they saw. This is what they showed up to. And so the captain of the Prince Robert said to all the officers, you will be given one of these men, and he will be treated like your long-lost brother. He will eat before you, he will sleep before you, and you will do everything you can to make that man's life better. There wasn't anybody that weighed 100 pounds out of all the men they found, of the 100 who had actually survived and the hundreds that had died. So he was given a fellow, all he had was a loincloth, big beard, bushy hair and everything. So anyway, Ken was told, okay, this is your guy. And as an officer on the vessel, he actually had his own cabin, and he went up and he thought, well, what am I going to give this guy to wear? Because he was a big guy, the other guy weighed 85 pounds. And the only thing he had, as an officer, every time he was on leave, he had to be in uniform. And so his civvies were in his locker, and he hadn't used them since the war started. So he thought, well, the only thing I have to give him is, so he hauls out the suit from Henderson and Cudmore, lays everything out on the bed. The guy comes in, he had a shower, and he comes in, and he's toweling his head off like this. And he looked down at the suit, and he looked at Ken, and he said, I sold you that suit 6 years ago. It was the clerk from Henderson and Cudmore that had moved to Manitoba, signed up with the Winnipeg Rifles, with the Royal Winnipeg Rifles. There he is there, Leo Durand. So I put that story on the radio on a Thursday, and on Saturday I'm standing at the cenotaph, and there was a tap on my shoulder, and this guy says, "Are you Dutch Thompson?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "How would you like to meet the guy that you were talking about on the radio the other day?" I said, "You got to be kidding." He said, no, he's actually home visiting." So I said, "Great." So after the service, I went down to the Legion in Charlottetown, and I talked to John Leo Durand. And he had heard the item on the radio, and he said, "Everything your father-in-law said about what happened is true." He said, "That was me." So here's the POWs arriving back in Vancouver. What a happy bunch. That wasn't just the ones from Hong Kong. There's also Singapore and Shanghai veterans on that vessel as well. So thanks for sharing our stories. One more thing, Joe. You can be dead and gone, but as long as we can listen to a voice that tells your story and shares your memories with others, some part of you stays alive. And I firmly believe that. So if you know anybody in your family, keep the stories going. Keep the stories going, because that's all we have in the end, are the stories. Thank you very much, everybody.